In May of 1720, on a single block of the Rue Quincampoix in the heart of Paris, a crowd stood shoulder to shoulder from dawn until well past midnight. Merchants, marquises, abbesses, and retired soldiers jostled against laundresses and coachmen, all of them clutching paper slips they hoped would make them rich before the week was out. A few doors down, an apartment on the ground floor had its shutters thrown open. Inside, a tall, pale Scotsman lay propped in a four-poster bed, dictating letters, signing transfers of shares, and receiving visitors who climbed a small wooden staircase to reach him. The man was John Law. The slips were shares in his Company of the Indies. And the reign he was about to print into existence was, for a few fevered months, the most coveted currency in Europe. It is easy, with 300 years of hindsight, to make the Mississippi bubble sound like an obvious swindle, the 18th century equivalent of a chain letter. It was not obvious then. It was, for a moment, the official financial policy of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Blessed by the regent himself, underwritten by the French crown, and defended in writing by some of the sharpest economic minds on the continent. The thing we will spend the rest of this hour trying to explain is smaller, stranger, and far more revealing than a stock chart. One document has survived the chaos, and it sits at the center of the story. In the spring of 1720, in the days before the crash, Law drafted a brief private memorandum for Philippe d'Orléans, the regent of France governing on behalf of the boy king Louis XV. The memorandum listed, in plain language, what Law still intended to do, how many new shares he wanted to issue, how much paper currency he planned to retire, and how he intended to defend the franc against the very inflation the system was producing. He filed it. The regent read it. 2 weeks later, the regent quietly began stripping Law of his authority. Why did the man running the system, the man who understood it best, write a confident recovery plan at the exact moment the system had become unrecoverable? That question, more than any share price, is the spine of what follows. So start with the size of the hole Law was hired to fill. When Louis XIV died in September of 1715, he left behind a kingdom that looked from the outside like the unquestioned master of Europe. Inside, the books were a disaster. The crown owed roughly 2 billion livres tournois, the French unit of account at the time. Annual interest payments alone ran about 165 million livres. The state's ordinary revenues covered barely a third of what was due. The new king was a child of 7. France was governed by his cousin, Philippe d'Orléans, as regent. Within months of taking control, Philippe faced a choice no one wanted: repudiate the debt outright and shatter the monarchy's credit, raise taxes until the peasantry revolted, or find a financier who could, by some trick of arithmetic, refinance the mess. He chose the third option. He chose a man named John Law. The numbers that follow are not estimates. They come from French Treasury archives, reconstructed by historians, most notably Antoine Murphy of University College Dublin, whose work on law and the Mississippi system remains the standard academic account. In May of 1716, Law opened the Banque Générale, a private bank authorized to issue paper notes backed, at least on paper, by specie. By late 1718, the Crown had taken the bank over and renamed it the Banque Royale. By 1719, the Crown had also absorbed Law's trading company, originally called the Compagnie d'Occident, and renamed it the Compagnie des Indes, the Company of the Indies, granting it a monopoly on French trade with Louisiana, the Mississippi Basin, and much of the East Indies. Every dividend the Crown owed on its old debt was now to be paid in shares of this single company. In effect, Law had become the holder of the French national debt, and the French crown had become the holder of his bank. Then the share price did something extraordinary. Shares of the Company of the Indies began 1719 trading at roughly 500 livres. By December of that year, they stood at around 10,000 livres, a rise of close to 1,900% in less than 12 months. An increase documented in the Mississippi History Now archive and corroborated by multiple economic histories. Paper notes issued by the Banque Royale multiplied in step. The monthly inflation rate reached roughly 23% in January of 1720. By some measures, the French money supply expanded nearly 7-fold in 2 years. The regent, facing a flood of opportunity to refinance the old debt at lower effective cost, issued more and more shares in Law's company at successively higher prices, each time using the new cash to buy back and cancel yet another slice of the Crown's obligations. On the surface, it was working. The Crown's interest payments fell. The economy, in theory, had liquidity it had lacked for a generation. In Paris, the first season of 1720 was, by all accounts, the most expensive in the city's history. So who was this man in the bed on Rue Quincampoix? John Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671, the son of a goldsmith and banker, into a life in which ledgers were read aloud at dinner. He was educated in mathematics and finance in London's financial districts, drifted into London's high-stakes gambling houses, and in 1694 killed a man named Edward Wilson in a duel over a card game involving an actress. Convicted of murder, he fled England for the continent, wandered through Amsterdam and Genoa, lost and won several fortunes at the gaming tables, and developed a private obsession with a single idea: He believed, with a clarity that frightened his friends, that no country as wealthy as France had any reason ever to be short of money. Paper, properly managed, was the answer. A country that used only metal money was, he wrote in a treatise circulated among European princes, voluntarily poor. He arrived in Paris in the right year, 1714, with the right enemies and the right idea, and within 18 months had the ear of the most powerful man in France. It is worth pausing on the trajectory. He was a murderer, a gambler, and a refugee from one kingdom's justice. By the end of 1719, he was in effect the financial dictator of another. The room where that transformation happened is the Palais Royal in Paris, the regent's residence, in the long winter evenings of late 1715 and 1716. The historical record, drawn largely from the contemporary memoirs of the Marquis de Dangeau and the Duc de Saint-Simon, gives us something close to a script. Law laid out his plan in a series of memoirs, polite letters addressed to the regent, asking for the right to establish a bank that could lend to the crown on terms no private lender would accept. The regent's initial response by Saint-Simon's account was a shrug. Nothing could be worse than what they had. Over the next 18 months, Law returned again and again, refining the scheme, demonstrating at a card table in the regent's apartments how a paper currency could, in theory, track specie, and quietly buying off opposition among the Paris Parlement, the high court that would have to register his edicts. By 1718, Law was living in the Palais Royal itself, holding what amounted to private office hours. By 1719, he was Controller General of Finances, the king's first minister for money, a position that no foreigner had ever held in French history. One French finance minister of the old school, Michel de Chamillard, had been reduced to selling his own silver plate to balance his accounts. Law replaced him, and within a quarter of the monarchy's working life, the language of French finance had changed. Now follow the second thread, because without it, the story is incomplete. Across the Channel in the spring of 1719, a man named John Blunt was pitching an almost identical scheme to the directors of the South Sea Company in London. Blunt was, like Law, a financier with a past. He had lost a fortune in the collapse of a different venture in 1710 and had spent the intervening years studying the way governments managed their debts. His idea was the same shape as Law's: take over the British national debt, refinance it in shares of a single monopoly trading company, ride the share price upward on a wave of speculation, and retire the old obligations at a profit. By the summer of 1720, shares of the South Sea Company were trading at roughly 8 times their issue price. By the autumn, they had collapsed to a fraction of that level, bankrupting a significant portion of the British gentry and forcing a public inquiry that would, eventually, devour the ministry of Robert Walpole's opponents. The two bubbles were not just parallel, they were entangled. French and British investors moved capital across the Channel in pursuit of whichever scheme was rising faster. When the Mississippi Company stopped rising, capital fled back to Paris. When the South Sea Company stopped rising, capital fled back to London. The two regimes collapsed within weeks of each other in the autumn of 1720. And the contagion logic discovered in that year has been used as a precedent for every financial panic since. Antoine Murphy has argued that the two schemes were so structurally similar that they can only have been studied by the same handful of European mathematicians and bankers, a tiny fraternity who understood both paper money and limited liability and who sold both ideas to two different governments in the same 18 months. Here's the twist that recontextualizes everything. Law was not, in the conventional sense, a fraudster. He was a true believer with an enormous conflict of interest, and the conflict of interest is what killed him. The plan was elegant: convert the crown's debt into shares in a productive trading monopoly, expand paper credit to support the conversion, retire the old rentes, and let the new trade eventually generate the specie that would back the paper. As a theory, it was not absurd. As a sequence, it required two things. France could not produce on the necessary timetable: enormous new trade with Louisiana and the East Indies, and a population of investors willing to hold shares while that trade was being built. Neither condition arrived. Louisiana produced no gold, no silver, and no quick returns. The Compagnie des Indes had to rely on imported goods and a small number of colonists, many of whom died within months of arrival. To keep the share price aloft while the real business was being built, Law did the one thing any sensible theorist of his own system would have warned him against. He printed more shares, at the higher and higher prices, and used the proceeds to fund the crown. In other words, he asked the French public to validate his debt reduction policy by paying ever more for the very paper that represented the debt he was retiring. When the rising share price stopped being believable, it stopped being useful. The crown, having by then taken his bank over to make it more credible, found itself trapped. It could not let the bank fail without letting the debt return. It could not let the debt return without destroying the crown's credit a second time. It could not stop printing without collapsing the share price. Law himself drafted the recovery plan we mentioned earlier, full of phased share retirements and gradual currency contraction. He understood the trap. He had built it. The contradiction is not that a con man fooled a kingdom. The contradiction is that a serious theorist, with the right of a state behind him, convinced himself that his own confidence was the asset. What did the experiment cost? Start with money. The nominal face value of paper notes that became effectively worthless runs into the hundreds of millions of livres. The share price collapsed from roughly 10,000 livres in December 1719 to roughly 1,000 livres by the end of 1720, wiped out the savings of tens of thousands of French households. Many of them small investors who had sold their rentes, mortgaged their houses, or borrowed from relatives in order to buy in. The historian Thomas Pitton de Saint-Martin, working from Paris notarial archives in the 1730s, estimated that perhaps half of the rentier class of Paris was effectively ruined. The crown's interest payments did, in fact, fall sharply, and a meaningful slice of the old debt was retired. France did not, as is sometimes said, leave the era systemically poorer than it had entered. It had merely redistributed the cost. Some of that redistributed cost fell on people who could not absorb it. Start with lives. In the summer of 1720, the same months when the share price began to break, a plague outbreak hit Marseille, then spread through Provence. Roughly 100,000 people died from plague in Provence that year, an estimate compiled from parish registers and reproduced in contemporary compilations. The outbreak wrecked the Marseille economy just as the bubble's collapse wrecked the broader French economy, and the two disasters fed on each other. The crown, out of cash, could not enforce quarantines. Investors, ruined, could not extend credit to merchants. Trade inside France contracted sharply. The fiscal wreckage of 1720 left the monarchy structurally weaker for the rest of the century, and historians including Murphy and, in a different register, François Velde, have argued that the trauma is part of why the French state entered 1789, already unable to borrow. The trajectory from Law's bedchamber in 1720 to the storming of the Bastille in 1789 is not continuous, but it is not random either. Law himself outlived the system by 9 years. He was stripped of his positions in 1720, allowed to leave France under a sort of quiet amnesty, and fled first to Brussels, then to England, then to Venice, where he tried to interest the Austrian governors of the Lombardy region in another version of the same scheme and failed. He died on March 21st, 1729, of pneumonia in modest lodgings in Venice in the company of his son. According to an Oxford account of his last days, his attendants found at his bedside a small locked box containing, among other things, the medal the regent had given him and a copy of the memorandum he had filed in May 1720. The memorandum outlived the system it tried to save. I want to be careful here about a temptation this story offers. The temptation is to treat John Law as a single identifiable villain, the man who broke France the way a saboteur might break a dam. The historical record does not support that reading. France entered the Regency in fiscal crisis. The crown could not service its debt. The peerage could not or would not be taxed. The Parliament, the High Court, would not register new taxes without political concessions no regent wanted to make. Law's scheme was, on paper, the most painless of the available options. Antoine de Saint-Simon, one of the better contemporary observers, came close to saying as much. He wrote that Law had at least tried a rational workaround to a problem the rest of the regime had refused to confront. The bubble's bursting was not, in the end, a story about one Scottish mathematician. It was a story about a kingdom that had run out of painless fiscal options, and was offered a painless option by a theorist who believed his own theory. The wrong move was not Law's. The wrong move was the regent's, made earlier. A generation of war finance on credit, culminating in a debt that could no longer be honestly serviced. By the time Law arrived, every honest option cost someone real money, and every dishonest option cost someone real money. The Mississippi bubble was the dishonest option that no one, including its creator, fully understood. What stays with you 300 years later is not the share price. It is the structural thing the share price revealed. A state that cannot borrow honestly will eventually borrow dishonestly. A financial innovator who promises to square that circle will be believed exactly as long as his confidence is contagious. Confidence, in such moments, is the only collateral that matters, and confidence has a half-life. Paper money does not create wealth. It reorganizes the timing of when wealth is recognized, and when the timing slips, the political cost lands on whoever was last in line. The Banque Royale failed because the crown needed the bank to succeed more than the bank needed the crown to behave well, and the asymmetry of need was the flaw. Anyone who has ever watched a modern central bank navigate that asymmetry should recognize the rhythm. 300 years is not as long as it sounds. If you have a key phrase we should treat as the title of the next video, drop it in the comments. I do read them, and we have built entire episodes out of what you have asked for. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, and consider, before you go, what other 18th century episode you would like to see through this same lens.